The midday sun reflected off the polished marble steps of Sapphire Bay Resort as Mei Liu approached the entrance. The sea breeze ruffled her simple linen shirt and loose-fitting pants, comfortable clothes she'd chosen for the long journey. Her well-worn backpack hung from one shoulder, containing just the essentials she needed until her luggage arrived later. Guests in designer swimwear and expensive sunglasses lounged around the infinity pool to her right, cocktails in hand despite the early hour. A valet rushed past her to greet a couple emerging from a sleek sports car, barely glancing in her direction. Mei tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and continued walking. She'd been looking forward to this rare break for months. Between the company's expansion and the endless meetings, she barely remembered what relaxation felt like anymore. The cool air inside the lobby washed over her as the glass doors slid open. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, their light dancing across marble floors so polished they reflected like mirrors. The lobby bustled with guests and staff, everyone seeming to move with purpose and privilege. "Welcome to Sapphire Bay," a receptionist called from behind a curved desk of dark wood and blue accent lighting. Mei approached with a small smile. "Hi, checking in, please." "Reservation under Liu." The receptionist, whose nameplate read Veronica, tapped at her keyboard. Her friendly expression flickered for just a moment as she glanced up, eyes traveling over Mei's simple clothes and practical sandals. "I'm sorry. I'm not seeing a reservation under that name," Veronica said, her tone slightly cooler than before. "Could it be under a different name?" "It shouldn't be. I confirmed it myself 3 days ago." Mei reached into her pocket for her phone, pulling up the email. "Here's the confirmation number." Veronica studied the screen, frowning slightly. "One moment, please." She picked up a phone, turning slightly away as she spoke in a hushed voice. Mei waited patiently, watching the other guests move through the lobby. A group of businessmen in tailored suits passed by, laughing about stock options. A woman draped in jewelry directed staff carrying her matching designer luggage. No one looked like her, Mei realized. No one looked like they'd packed their own bags or checked their own reservations. A man in an expensive suit emerged from an office behind the reception desk, walking over with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The gold pin on his lapel identified him as the resort manager. "Good afternoon. I'm Richard, the manager here at Sapphire Bay. There seems to be a misunderstanding with your reservation," he said, standing behind Veronica. "I don't think so," Mei replied calmly, turning her phone toward him. "My confirmation is right here." Richard barely glanced at it. "Yes, well, unfortunately, we're completely booked for the holiday weekend. Perhaps there was a system error when your reservation was processed." The slight pause before reservation wasn't lost on Mei. She'd heard that tone before, at boutiques and restaurants where people took one look at her unassuming appearance and made assumptions. "I understand you're busy, but I confirmed this booking weeks ago and reconfirmed it recently. Surely there must be something available." She kept her voice level, reasonable. Richard's smile tightened. "I'm afraid Sapphire Bay caters to a certain clientele, Ms. Liu," she supplied, noticing he hadn't bothered to ask. "Ms. Liu, our rooms start at $1,200 per night. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the Bayside Inn down the shore? It's more accessible." The implication hung in the air between them. A flash of indignation rose in Mei's chest, but she suppressed it. Getting angry wouldn't help. "I'm aware of your rates. As I mentioned, I have a confirmed reservation, which appears to have been made in error," Richard countered smoothly. He lowered his voice. "We maintain certain standards for our guests to ensure everyone's experience meets expectations. I'm sure you understand." Mei understood perfectly. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. Her watch wasn't gold or diamond encrusted. She hadn't arrived in a luxury car. In Richard's eyes, she didn't belong. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Mei said quietly. Richard's expression hardened slightly. "I am the general manager of this property. There is no supervisor to speak to." He gestured toward the door. "Now, if you don't mind, we have guests waiting to check in." Mei looked past him at the empty lobby. The only people waiting were a couple being served champagne by another receptionist. She took a deep breath. "I will not be leaving. I have a valid reservation and I expect it to be honored." 10 minutes and several increasingly heated exchanges later, Mei found herself outside the resort, watching as the security guard who'd escorted her out returned through the gleaming glass doors. The man had at least looked embarrassed about the situation, muttering an apology as he'd walked her to the edge of the property. She stood there for a moment, stunned by what had happened. In all her travels, she'd never been treated this way. The resort staff had looked at her simple appearance and decided she didn't deserve to stay, despite her confirmed booking. May walked down to the public beach adjacent to the resort property. Finding a small cafe overlooking the harbor, she ordered an iced tea and sat at an outdoor table. The server brought her drink with a kind smile, a refreshing change from the coldness she'd experienced at the resort. The tea was sweet and cold, exactly what she needed to cool her frustration. May watched the yachts bobbing in the marina, their polished surfaces gleaming in the afternoon sun. Wealthy holidaymakers moved between the boats and the shore, carefree and confident that doors would open for them wherever they went. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a familiar contact. For a moment, her finger hovered over the name. She rarely relied on her husband's influence or their shared wealth. They'd both agreed long ago to maintain a low profile, to remember the simplicity they'd grown up with despite the success they'd achieved later. But sometimes, principles had to bend in the face of injustice. She pressed the call button, and her husband picked up almost immediately. "Hello, my love," she said, switching to Mandarin. "There's been a small problem at the resort." She explained what happened in brief, measured sentences, careful not to let her lingering irritation show in her voice. As she spoke, she noticed a few heads turn at the sound of the foreign language, but she paid them no mind. "No, please don't be upset," she continued when she heard the anger rising in her husband's voice. "It's not worth getting worked up about." The cafe owner approached with a fresh glass of iced tea. "On the house," he said with a friendly nod. "You look like you could use it." May thanked him with a genuine smile before returning to her conversation. "I'm fine, really. I'm sitting at a lovely little place called Harborview Cafe." She glanced out at the water. "You can actually see the resort dock from here." She listened for a moment, then laughed softly. "That's not necessary. You don't need to—" She paused. "You're already on your way? But your conference—" The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and sunscreen. A group of children raced past, chasing a colorful kite that danced in the breeze. "All right," she finally conceded, "but promise me you won't make a scene. The last thing we need is attention." After a few more minutes of conversation, May ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She sipped her tea, settling in to enjoy the view. The water in the bay was a stunning shade of turquoise, framed by white sand beaches and swaying palm trees. Despite everything, it was a beautiful place. The cafe owner passed by again. "Everything okay, miss?" "Yes, thank you," May smiled. "I'm just waiting for my husband. He should be here soon." The man nodded and moved on to other customers. May checked the time. Just past 2 in the afternoon. She estimated it would be at least another hour or two before her husband arrived, depending on how quickly he could arrange transportation. She ordered a light lunch and watched the comings and goings in the harbor. Fishing boats returning with their catches, tourists boarding glass-bottomed boats for reef tours, a Coast Guard vessel making its routine patrol. As she finished her meal, May noticed increased activity at the resort's private dock. Staff members in crisp uniforms were hurrying about, straightening flags and polishing already gleaming railings. Something, or someone important was expected. She smiled to herself, knowing exactly what was causing the commotion. Part of her wanted to return to the resort immediately, to see the look on Richard's face when he realized his mistake. But the wiser part of her knew it would be better to let things unfold naturally. May paid her bill, leaving a generous tip for the kind cafe owner. Then she found a comfortable bench along the harbor walk with a perfect view of both the resort and its dock. She settled in, pulled a book from her backpack, and began to read. But her attention kept drifting to the horizon, where at any moment her husband's yacht would appear. Not because she needed rescuing. Mei Lu had never needed rescuing in her life. But because sometimes, just sometimes, it was satisfying to remind people that appearances could be deceiving. The afternoon sun warmed her face as she waited, perfectly content in her simple clothes and practical sandals. In 2 hours, everything would change. But for now, she was simply May, enjoying a beautiful day by the sea, invisible to the very people who would soon be falling over themselves to please her. The first hint that something extraordinary was about to happen came when 3 sleek black speedboats entered the bay. They moved with purpose, their crews dressed in matching Navy uniforms scanning the waters as they established a perimeter. Tourists along the harbor pointed and took photos, wondering what celebrity or dignitary might be arriving. May smiled to herself as she watched from her bench. She recognized the security protocol. Her husband never traveled without his team, despite her gentle teasing about his overabundance of caution. In their position, he always reminded her, precautions were necessary. At the resort dock, staff members had multiplied like ants around spilled sugar. Someone had rolled out an actual red carpet that now stretched the length of the pier. The manager, Richard, paced back and forth, barking orders and straightening his already immaculate tie every few seconds. May checked her watch. Her husband was early, as usual. She had expected to wait at least another hour, but Zhang Wei had always hated being apart from her, even before they had the means to do anything about it. A crowd began to gather along the public section of the harbor as word spread that something big was happening. Vendors selling ice cream and souvenirs paused their business to watch. Children stopped building sandcastles and pointed out to sea, and then it appeared on the horizon, a gleaming white vessel that seemed to part the waters like a knife. Even at this distance, its size was impressive, dwarfing every other boat in the harbor. The afternoon sun caught its polished surface, making it shine like a beacon. "Is that the Northern Star?" May overheard someone ask excitedly. "It's even bigger," another voice replied with awe. "That's the Azure Dragon, belongs to Zhang Wei, the tech billionaire. My brother works for a yacht magazine. Says it cost nearly $300 million. May suppressed a smile. The yacht had actually cost significantly more than that, but her husband had insisted on keeping the true figure out of the press. Some things should remain private, he'd told her when they commissioned it. As the yacht drew closer, its features became more distinct. The 3 decks, the helicopter pad, the infinity pool that seemed to blend with the ocean itself. May knew that inside were art pieces from emerging artists they supported, furniture crafted by artisans from their hometown, and countless other touches that made it feel like a floating piece of home. At the resort, the commotion had reached fever pitch. A woman in a business suit, clearly a public relations executive, was handing out briefing cards to the staff. Waiters lined up with trays of champagne. The chef and his team stood at attention, no doubt ready to offer a special menu. May felt a twinge of sympathy for them. They had no idea that their honored guest had no intention of staying at their resort. The yacht slowed as it approached the harbor, the security boats guiding it toward the Sapphire Bay dock. Even the most jaded of the resort guests had abandoned their poolside loungers to gawk. Phone cameras flashed as people documented the spectacle. With practiced precision, the crew secured the vessel to the dock. A gangway extended like a welcoming hand. Richard stood at the end of the red carpet, his posture perfect, his smile wide and practiced. May couldn't hear what was being said from her position, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Richard was practically bowing as the first security team members disembarked. Behind them came Liang, her husband's chief of staff, looking as efficient and unruffled as always in his tailored suit. She could just imagine the conversation. "Welcome to Sapphire Bay Resort. We're honored to have Mr. Zhang staying with us. We've prepared our presidential suite and Mr. Zhang won't be staying," Liang would interrupt politely but firmly. "He's here for a brief meeting only." Richard's confusion would be setting in right about now, May thought. The yacht, the security, the grand arrival, all this for a meeting. And then her husband appeared at the top of the gangway, and May's heart did a little jump the way it always did when she saw him after any separation. He was dressed in simple linen pants and a white shirt, not unlike her own outfit, their shared preference for comfort over flash. Only his watch, a rare timepiece from a master craftsman they'd met in Switzerland, hinted at his wealth. Even from a distance, May could see the slight frown on his face as he surveyed the resort. Zhang Wei had never been good at hiding his emotions, at least not from her. He was annoyed, and when her normally calm husband was annoyed, things happened. He descended the gangway with Liang at his side, shaking Richard's hand briefly but not pausing for pleasantries. Instead, he looked around, clearly searching for someone, searching for her. For a moment, May considered staying where she was, letting the scene play out without her intervention. It would certainly be satisfying to see Richard's face when he realized who she was, but that wasn't her style. They had built their company and their fortune on treating people with respect. even those who hadn't offered the same courtesy. She stood, brushing off her pants, and made her way along the harbor walk toward the resort dock. As she approached, a security team member spotted her and spoke quietly into his wrist mic. Within seconds, her husband turned in her direction, relief washing over his features. Abandoning all protocol, Jiang Wei stepped off the red carpet and strode toward her, ignoring Richard's confused expression and the PR woman's barely concealed panic at the deviation from whatever grand welcome they had planned. They met at the edge of the resort property, the very spot where the security guard had escorted her off the premises earlier. "You're early," May said in Mandarin, smiling up at him. "The winds were favorable," he replied, taking her hands in his. "Are you all right?" "Of course. It was just a misunderstanding." She squeezed his hands reassuringly. "A misunderstanding they'll deeply regret." There was a protective edge to his voice that had been there since they were teenagers, long before they had the power to back it up. May shook her head. "No making scenes, remember? You promised." "I only promised not to buy the entire chain and fire everyone," he said with a small smile. "And I won't. But this matters, May. How they treated you matters." She knew he was right. It wasn't about hurt feelings or wounded pride. It was about a pattern of behavior that affected many people who didn't have a billionaire spouse to call when doors were closed in their faces. Together, they walked back toward the dock where Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion as he tried to understand why the VIP he'd been preparing to welcome was now walking arm in arm with the woman he'd turned away hours earlier. Liang stepped forward, his expression professionally neutral but with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Mr. Richard, allow me to formally introduce Mr. Jiang Wei, founder and CEO of Azure Tech, and his wife, Ms. Mei Lu, co-founder and chief innovation officer." The color drained from Richard's face as understanding dawned. "Ms. Liu, there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he stammered. "Yes, there has," Jiang Wei agreed, his voice pleasant but firm. "My wife had a confirmed reservation at this resort, which you chose to ignore." "Had I known who she was," Richard began. "That's precisely the problem," May interrupted gently. "The way someone is treated shouldn't depend on who they are or what they're wearing." The PR woman stepped forward, damage control mode fully activated. "Ms. Lu, Mr. Jiang, please accept our deepest apologies. We would be honored if you would reconsider staying with us. The presidential suite is ready, and we can arrange a private dinner with our executive chef." "That won't be necessary," Jiang Wei said. "We have accommodations." He gestured toward the yacht. By now, a small crowd of resort staff and guests had gathered, watching the scene unfold. Phones were out recording the interaction. Tomorrow, May knew, social media would be buzzing with the story. The billionaire's wife turned away from a luxury resort only to return on a super yacht. However, May added, seeing the crestfallen expressions, "We would like to speak with the resort's ownership about certain policies and practices." The PR woman looked relieved at this opening. "Of course. We can arrange a call with our corporate office." That won't be necessary either," Jiang Wei said. "As of last week, Azure Ventures is the majority shareholder in Sapphire Bay Resort Group." This news clearly came as a shock to the staff. Richard's mouth opened and closed without words coming out. May hadn't planned for her husband to reveal that particular detail today. They had acquired the resort chain as part of a larger investment in sustainable luxury tourism, with plans to gradually implement new standards across all properties. But Jiang Wei had always had a flair for the dramatic moment. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion somewhere more private," May suggested, noticing the growing audience. Richard nodded dumbly, gesturing toward the main building. As they walked through the resort grounds, May noticed how differently the staff looked at her now, with recognition, respect, and more than a little fear. It wasn't what she wanted. She had never sought to be feared. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said quietly to her husband as they followed Richard. "I could have handled this." "I know you could have," Jiang Wei replied, slipping his arm around her waist. "You can handle anything. But just because you can doesn't mean you should have to." He paused. "Besides, I missed you." May leaned into him slightly, grateful not for his wealth or power, but for the simple fact that after 20 years together, he still crossed oceans just to be by her side. Behind them, the azure dragon gleamed in the afternoon sun, a floating testament to their journey from the small apartment they'd shared as struggling entrepreneurs to the world they now inhabited. But more importantly, it was the home they would return to tonight, just the two of them, where they could kick off their shoes and be simply Wei and May, as they had always been. Richard led them through the resort lobby where conversations hushed as they passed. May noticed staff members whispering behind cupped hands, eyes wide with recognition and alarm. The same receptionists who had dismissed her earlier now stood rigidly at attention, their faces pale. They were shown to a spacious conference room overlooking the ocean. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the turquoise waters, and through them, the azure dragon dominated the view, a constant reminder of what had transpired. "Can I offer you refreshments while we wait for our director of operations?" Richard asked, his confident demeanor from earlier completely evaporated. "Water will be fine," May replied simply. "I've taken the liberty of contacting our regional vice president," Richard added. "She's on her way from the main island." Jiang Wei nodded but said nothing, his silence more effective than any words could be. He had mastered this technique over years of business negotiations, the power of a withheld response. A young staff member entered with water and departed so quickly she nearly collided with the doorframe. Minutes later, a harried-looking woman in her 40s rushed in, smoothing her skirt as she extended her hand. "Mr. Zhang, Ms. Liu, I'm Patricia Huang, Director of Operations for Sapphire Bay. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for this unfortunate incident. Please, sit." May gestured to the chair across from them. "There's no need for panic." Patricia sat but perched on the edge of her seat as if ready to spring up at any moment. "I understand there was a serious lapse in our service standards today." "It was more than a service lapse," Jiang Wei said, his voice calm but firm. "My wife was profiled and discriminated against based on her appearance." Richard, who had been hovering near the door, stepped forward. "If I may explain—" "Actually," May interrupted gently, "I'd like to see the security footage first." A moment of awkward silence followed. Patricia and Richard exchanged glances. "The security footage?" Patricia repeated. "Yes," May confirmed. "From the lobby. I assume everything is recorded?" "Of course," Patricia nodded quickly. "I'll have it brought up immediately." She tapped something into her tablet, and within minutes a large screen on the wall flickered to life. Richard looked distinctly uncomfortable as Patricia navigated to the correct timestamp. The footage was crystal clear. May approaching the front desk, her polite interactions with the receptionist, and then Richard's arrival. Though there was no audio, his dismissive body language was unmistakable. The recording showed May presenting her phone with the reservation confirmation, Richard barely glancing at it, and his increasingly condescending posture as the conversation continued. Finally, it captured the security guard escorting her out. No one spoke as the footage ended. Patricia's face had grown increasingly troubled as she watched. "This is not how we train our staff to behave," she finally said, her voice quiet. "And yet it happened," Jiang Wei pointed out. "The question is why?" Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Zhang, in my position, I have to make quick judgments about people who might not be suitable for our establishment. Your wife wasn't dressed like our typical guests, and she arrived without what?" May asked. "Without designer clothes? Without diamonds? Without a chauffeur? Our clients have certain expectations about the exclusivity of—" "I'm not interested in excuses," Jiang Wei cut in. "What concerns me is that this isn't an isolated incident." Patricia looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" May pulled out her phone and opened a document. "In the 2 hours I spent waiting for my husband, I did some research. I found 37 reviews from the past year alone mentioning similar experiences at various Sapphire Bay properties. People with confirmed reservations being turned away or treated poorly based on their appearance, accent, or perceived socioeconomic status." She handed the phone to Patricia, who scrolled through the collection of reviews, her expression growing more distressed with each swipe. "I wasn't aware of this pattern," she admitted. "That's part of the problem," Jiang Wei said. "These complaints are being buried or dismissed as the grumblings of people who couldn't afford to stay here in the first place." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, sir, maintaining a certain atmosphere is part of the luxury experience. Our guests pay premium rates to ensure they're surrounded by people of a similar caliber." The room fell silent. Even Patricia looked shocked at Richard's candor. "Similar caliber?" He repeated slowly. "And how exactly do you determine someone's caliber, Richard?" He struggled to find an appropriate response. "Let me tell you why we purchased this resort chain," May continued, not waiting for his answer. "We believe that luxury and exclusivity shouldn't be defined by wealth or status, but by the quality of service and experience provided to every guest." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yacht that had caused such a stir. 20 years ago, my husband and I couldn't have afforded to stay at a place like this. We built our company from nothing, working out of a one-room apartment, eating instant noodles for dinner. Jiang Wei smiled at the memory. "The point is, you never know who someone is or who they might become based on their appearance at a single moment in time." A knock at the door interrupted them. A nervous young man entered with a tablet. "Ms. Huang, the board members are on the video call you requested." Patricia excused herself and stepped out briefly. When she returned, her demeanor had changed subtly, the nervous deference replaced by something more genuinely respectful. "Mr. Zhang, Ms. Liu, our board chairman would like to speak with you personally. They're deeply concerned about what's happened." "I'm sure they are," Jiang Wei said dryly, "now that they know who my wife is." "That's precisely the issue," May noted. "The concern comes only after learning about our position. What about all those other guests who were turned away, who didn't have a voice or the power to be heard?" Patricia nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, of a truth she'd long ignored in her corporate climb. "You're absolutely right. This isn't just about today. It's systemic." The door opened again and an older man in a crisp uniform appeared, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Zhang, Ms. Liu, I'm Thomas, the general manager of the resort group for this region. I just flew in from the main island." "That was quick," May observed. "When the board chairman calls personally, you move quickly," Thomas admitted. He turned to Richard. "I've reviewed the security footage remotely. I'd like you to wait in my office. We'll discuss this later." Richard left without another word, his rigid posture betraying his anxiety. Once the door closed, Thomas's professional mask slipped slightly. "I apologize for speaking bluntly, but we're facing a significant problem here. Beyond the inexcusable treatment of Ms. Liu, this incident has already reached social media." He handed them his tablet, showing videos taken by resort guests of Jiang Wei's arrival and his reunion with May. One clip had already garnered over 50,000 views with the caption, "Billionaire's wife kicked out of luxury resort returns on 300 Billionaire's yacht. Best revenge ever," May sighed. This was exactly what they tried to avoid. The spectacle, the public attention. "This isn't about revenge." "I understand," Thomas said, though his expression suggested he didn't entirely. In his world, power was for wielding, not restraining. "What can we do to make this right?" Jiang Wei looked at his wife, deferring to her as he often did in matters requiring a delicate touch. "We don't want special treatment or apologies," May said. "What we want is change." She outlined her thoughts. A complete overhaul of training protocols, anonymous testers to evaluate staff behavior, a revision of guest policies to emphasize respect regardless of appearance, and the implementation of a meaningful feedback system that actually reached management. Thomas took notes rapidly, nodding. "These are excellent suggestions. Of course, implementing such changes takes time. 3 months, Jiang Wei stated. "It wasn't a suggestion. That's ambitious," Thomas hedged. "It's necessary," May countered. And as the new majority shareholders were prepared to allocate additional resources to make it happen. Outside the conference room, they could hear the normal sounds of the resort resuming, guests chatting, staff moving about, life continuing. But inside this room, a transformation was beginning that would ripple through the entire chain. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave, a young housekeeper timidly approached May in the hallway. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Excuse me, Ms. Liu? I just wanted to say, thank you." "For what?" May asked gently. "For seeing us. The staff, I mean." She lowered her voice. "Many guests treat us like we're invisible. Or worse, like Richard treats the guests he doesn't think belong here." May touched the woman's shoulder lightly. "No one is invisible. Remember that." Walking back through the lobby toward the dock where a boat waited to take them back to the yacht, May noticed how differently everything looked now. The same marble floors, the same crystal chandeliers, but her perspective had shifted. "You're quiet," Jiang Wei observed as they reached the waterfront. "Just thinking," she replied, watching the resort staff scramble to roll up the red carpet that now seemed so ridiculous. About value. Real value. He nodded, understanding as he always did. Not the price of things. Exactly. She squeezed his hand as they stepped onto the boat. Do you think anything will really change here? Jiang Wei looked back at the resort, then at his wife. With you involved? Absolutely. As their boat pulled away from the dock, May caught a glimpse of Richard watching from a window, his expression unreadable. She didn't feel satisfaction at his discomfort or pleasure at the resort's scramble to make amends. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. This wasn't about one woman's wounded pride or one man's comeuppance. It was about something much larger, the invisible walls that separated people, and the power of those who could see them to tear them down. The evening sun cast long shadows across the deck of the Azure Dragon as May and Jiang Wei enjoyed a quiet dinner. The yacht's chef had prepared their favorite comfort foods, simple dishes that reminded them of home, not the elaborate cuisine one might expect on a vessel of this caliber. Two unexpected adventures, Jiang Wei said, raising his glass of iced tea. Neither of them drank alcohol, another detail that often surprised people who had preconceptions about the ultra-wealthy. May clinked her glass against his. I'm sorry our vacation started this way. I'm not, he replied with a small smile. Some good will come of it. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the resort lights twinkle against the darkening sky. Occasionally they could see camera flashes from the shore, tourists trying to capture images of the famous yacht. It's already trending, Liang said, approaching with a tablet in hand. Despite May and Jiang Wei's request for privacy during dinner, their chief of staff knew which matters couldn't wait. The video of your arrival has over 1 million views. News outlets are picking up the story, May sighed. What are they saying? Liang scrolled through the tablet. The usual sensationalism. Billionaire's epic revenge. Resort's billion-dollar mistake, that sort of thing. That's not what happened, Jiang Wei frowned. It rarely is, Liang agreed. But there's also this. He handed them the tablet. On the screen was a social media post from someone claiming to be a former Sapphire Bay employee. It detailed a pattern of discrimination against guests who didn't look the part, with staff allegedly given unofficial guidelines about who to accommodate and who to discourage. This supports what you found in the reviews, Liang noted. And since your incident went viral, dozens more people have come forward with similar stories from various Sapphire Bay locations. Have their PR team responded? May asked, a standard statement about investigating the matter and reaffirming their commitment to excellent service for all guests. Jiang Wei handed the tablet back. Keep monitoring the situation, but no statements from us. This isn't about us personally. Understood, Liang nodded. Also, the corporate board is requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. We'll be there, May said. After Liang departed, Jiang Wei leaned back in his chair. So much for our quiet getaway. We could still salvage it, May suggested. The southern islands are beautiful this time of year. We could sail tonight? For a moment, Jiang Wei looked tempted. Then he shook his head. And leave this unfinished? That's not like you, May smiled, knowing he was right. Neither of them had built their success by walking away from challenges. 1 week, she proposed. We give them 1 week to show real commitment to change, then we continue our vacation. Deal, he agreed. The next morning found them in the resort's largest conference room, now filled with nervous executives. The entire regional leadership team had flown in overnight, along with 4 members of the corporate board who had chartered a private jet from the mainland. The board chairman, an older man named Chen who had known Jiang Wei for years through business circles, greeted them personally. We've reviewed the security footage and the staff reports, Chen said after introductions were complete. The behavior was completely unacceptable. Richard has been terminated, effective immediately. That's not what we asked for, May said, surprising everyone in the room. Chen blinked. But surely after how he treated you, firing one person doesn't solve a systemic problem, she explained patiently. Richard acted according to what he believed were the resort's true values, regardless of your official policies. The room fell silent as the executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. What exactly are you suggesting? Asked one of the board members, a woman with sharp eyes and a skeptical expression. May opened her laptop and turned it to face the group. On the screen was a comprehensive proposal, not hastily assembled overnight but carefully crafted during those quiet hours on the yacht. A complete cultural overhaul, she explained, starting with honest acknowledgement of the problem. For the next 2 hours, she walked them through her plan. It included revised training protocols, anonymous evaluations, a complete review of hiring practices, and perhaps most radically, a program to bring in guests from diverse backgrounds who would normally never have the opportunity to experience such luxury. "You want us to give away free stays?" one executive asked incredulously. "I want you to invest in changing perceptions," May corrected, "both within your staff and in the broader community." Zhang Wei, who had been mostly quiet during the presentation, finally spoke up. "As majority shareholders, we could simply mandate these changes. We're choosing instead to seek your genuine commitment." The skeptical board member leaned forward. "And if we believe some of these measures go too far, then we'll need to reconsider our investment," he replied simply. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact, but it hung in the air with unmistakable weight. The Sapphire Bay Resort Group had been struggling financially before Azure Ventures' investment. Everyone in the room knew it. Chen cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could implement these changes gradually, starting with a pilot program at this location." May shook her head. "Half measures won't work. The problem exists throughout your organization." "May I make a suggestion?" Patricia spoke up from the back of the room. All eyes turned to her in surprise. As director of operations, she rarely contributed to board-level discussions. "Please." May nodded encouragingly. "What if we brought in some of the people who've reported negative experiences, not just as guests but as consultants to help us see our blind spots?" A murmur ran through the room. It was an unconventional idea, especially for a luxury brand that typically kept complaints as quiet as possible. "That's actually brilliant," May said, genuinely impressed. The meeting continued with increasing energy as more staff members began contributing ideas, many building on Patricia's suggestion. By lunchtime, what had begun as a crisis management session had transformed into something that felt more like a workshop for genuine change. As they broke for lunch, Chen approached May and Zhang Wei privately. "I must admit, this isn't what I expected when I flew in this morning. I thought we'd be discussing damage control and compensation." "We're not interested in being bought off," Zhang Wei replied. "I understand that now." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've been in this business for 30 years. The luxury market has always operated on exclusivity, the idea that special experiences should be reserved for special people. And who decides who's special?" May asked quietly. Chen had no answer for that. After lunch, the practical details were hammered out. A committee would be formed with May serving as an advisor. The first report on implemented changes would be due in exactly 3 months, as Zhang Wei had initially demanded. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out, Patricia approached May. "The housekeeper you spoke with yesterday, Lily, asked if she could join the committee. She's worked here for 12 years and says she has a lot to share about how guests from different backgrounds are treated." "That's exactly who should be on the committee," May agreed. "The people who see everything." By late afternoon, May and Zhang Wei were back on their yacht, watching the sunset from the upper deck. "Do you think anything will really change?" May asked, echoing her question from the previous day. "It already has," Zhang Wei observed. "Did you see how differently the staff were interacting with guests of all types today? Word has spread quickly. May had noticed it too. A subtle but unmistakable shift in how the resort employees carried themselves, more attentive to all guests rather than just those who fit a certain profile. "It's a start," she acknowledged, "but lasting change takes more than a day, which is why we'll check in after our vacation," he reminded her. "Speaking of which, Southern Islands tomorrow?" she suggested. "Absolutely." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the resort lights twinkling below them. May's phone buzzed with an email notification. The first draft of the public statement the resort would be releasing in the morning, sent for her review. She set it aside without reading it. "It could wait until tomorrow. You know what I keep thinking about?" she said after a while. "What's that?" "All the people who were turned away who didn't have a yacht to come back on, who simply accepted that they didn't belong." Zhang Wei took her hand. "That's why this matters." "Oh yeah," she agreed. "That's exactly why." In the harbor below, a small tour boat passed by the Azure Dragon, its passengers pointing and taking photos. Among them was a young girl who waved enthusiastically at the yacht. May waved back, smiling. Perhaps that girl would grow up in a world with fewer invisible barriers. Perhaps she would never know what it felt like to be told she didn't belong somewhere based on appearances alone. It wasn't world peace or an end to poverty, May reflected, but it was something. A small change that might lead to larger ones, and sometimes that was enough to count as a good day's work. 6 months later, the Azure Dragon returned to Sapphire Bay. This time, there was no commotion, no red carpet, no frantic staff rushing about. The yacht's arrival had been deliberately kept quiet at May's request. "Are you sure about this?" Jiang Wei asked as they prepared to disembark. "We could have called for an update instead of coming in person." May adjusted her simple linen shirt, nearly identical to the one she'd worn that fateful day. "Numbers and reports only tell half the story. I want to see it with my own eyes." They had spent 3 glorious weeks exploring the southern islands after the incident, deliberately disconnecting from the media storm that followed. Upon their return to the mainland, they had monitored the resort's progress through regular updates from the committee. But this would be their first visit back to the property. No security team this time, May reminded her husband as they boarded the small tender boat that would take them to shore. "Just the 2 of us," he agreed, though she could tell he was still a bit uncomfortable with the arrangement. Old habits died hard. As they approached the dock, May noticed the first change immediately. Gone was the exclusive VIP entrance that had previously separated worthy guests from ordinary visitors. Instead, a single elegant welcome area greeted all arrivals, whether they came by yacht, ferry, or fishing boat. The young staff member who met them at the dock showed no sign of recognizing them, treating them with the same warm professionalism she presumably showed all guests. "Welcome to Sapphire Bay. May I have your names, please?" "Liu and Zhang," May replied, deliberately using their less recognizable family names. The woman checked her tablet. "I don't see a reservation under those names. Let me double-check with the front desk." May and Jiang Wei exchanged glances. This felt eerily familiar, but the staff member's tone remained courteous and concerned, not dismissive. "Perhaps it's under Azure Ventures," Jiang Wei suggested after a moment. The woman's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "Mr. Jiang Wei and Ms. Liu? I'm so sorry, I didn't realize—" "Please." May raised a hand gently. "That's exactly how it should be. We don't want special treatment." "Of course," the woman nodded, quickly regaining her composure. "Though I should mention that Ms. Patricia has been notified of your arrival. She asked to be informed when you came, no matter the time." "That's fine," Jiang Wei said. "But we'd like to walk through the resort as regular guests first, if that's possible." "Absolutely. Please enjoy your visit. If you need anything at all, any staff member will be happy to assist you." They walked through the grounds, noting subtle but significant changes. The staff, still impeccably dressed and professional, now interacted with all guests with the same level of attentiveness. Families with children, elderly couples, and young backpackers who had clearly saved for this special splurge were all treated with equal respect. "The atmosphere feels different," May observed as they paused by the infinity pool. "More relaxed," Jiang Wei agreed. "Less performative." They continued their tour, deliberately taking time to observe interactions between staff and guests. Near the beach bar, they overheard a server patiently explaining menu options to a couple who clearly weren't familiar with some of the more exotic offerings. There was no condescension in his tone, only genuine helpfulness. "Mr. Zhang, Ms. Liu," a familiar voice called to them. They turned to see Patricia approaching, her face breaking into a genuine smile. "I'm so glad you came." They greeted her warmly, and she insisted on showing them the concrete changes that had been implemented. "We completely revamped our training program," she explained as they walked. "Every staff member from housekeeping to management goes through the same course on implicit bias and inclusive service." She led them to a wall near the staff entrance where a framed document hung prominently. "Our new service pledge." It was actually written by a committee of employees from all levels. May read it silently, impressed by the simple but powerful commitment. "We serve with dignity, respect, and warmth, the same for every guest, every time." "And this is just the beginning," Patricia continued, her enthusiasm evident. "The changes have been implemented across all 15 properties in the group now." "What about Richard?" Jiang Wei asked as they continued their tour. Patricia's expression turned thoughtful. "That's actually an interesting story. After he was let go, he reached out to the committee, asked if he could speak with them, and," May prompted, He acknowledged his behavior and asked for a chance to be part of the solution. He's now working with our corporate training team, using his experience as a cautionary example for other managers. May nodded, pleased by this unexpected development. And the housekeeper, Lily? Patricia smiled. She's been promoted to guest relations supervisor. She's brilliant at anticipating needs that other staff might miss, especially for guests from different cultural backgrounds. As they rounded a corner near the main pool, they noticed a small group of young adults being led on a tour by a staff member. They didn't fit the typical guest profile. Their clothes were simple and they carried inexpensive cameras. That's part of our community outreach program, Patricia explained, following their gaze. Local university students in hospitality programs. They spend a weekend here learning about luxury service standards. Many of them become interns and several have already joined our staff permanently. That wasn't in the reports, Jiang Wei noted with approval. It was Lily's idea, Patricia said. She pointed out that we can't diversify our guests if we don't diversify our staff first. They continued toward the restaurant for lunch, where they were seated at a regular table, not the VIP section that would have automatically been prepared for them before. Their server, an older man with kind eyes, treated them with the same warm professionalism they'd observed throughout their visit. It wasn't until they were nearly finished with their meal that he leaned in slightly. "I hope you don't mind me saying so," he said quietly. "But what you did here made a difference, not just for the guests, but for us too." Before they could respond, he straightened and moved on to his other tables, maintaining the discretion that was part of his profession. After lunch, they met with the full implementation committee in a conference room overlooking the bay. The group was refreshingly diverse, from executives to frontline staff representing various backgrounds, ages, and levels of experience. "The financial results might interest you," Chen said, sliding a folder across the table. "We were concerned initially that the changes might impact our bottom line." Jiang Wei reviewed the numbers, his eyebrows rising slightly before passing the documents to May. "Revenue is up 17%, she noted with surprise. "Turns out, when you treat people well, they tell other people," one of the committee members explained. "We're seeing much higher return rates and personal referrals." "And the guest satisfaction scores?" Jiang Wei asked. "Highest they've ever been," Chen confirmed. "But more importantly, they're consistent across all guest demographics. Before, our highest scores came exclusively from our wealthiest clients." The meeting continued with detailed discussions about next steps and future plans. The committee had ambitious ideas for expanding their inclusive approach, including partnerships with other hospitality groups to share best practices. As the sun began to set, Mei and Jiang Wei made their way back to the dock where their tender awaited. The same young staff member who had greeted them escorted them. "Did you enjoy your visit?" she asked politely. "Very much," Mei replied. "It feels like a different place now." "I've only been here 4 months," the young woman admitted. "But the older staff say the same thing. They tell the story of how it all changed to every new employee." "What story is that?" Jiang Wei asked curiously. The young woman smiled. "About the woman who was turned away because of how she looked, not knowing she was actually the owner. But the important part of the story isn't who she turned out to be. It's that no one should be judged by their appearance in the first place." Mei and Jiang Wei exchanged glances, pleased that the real message had taken root. As their tender pulled away from the shore, they looked back at the resort glowing with warm light against the darkening sky. "We did good work here," Jiang Wei said, slipping his arm around his wife's shoulders. "We started something good," Mei corrected gently. "They're the ones doing the real work now." On the short journey back to their yacht, they passed a small fishing boat heading out for a night on the water. The fisherman waved at them casually, not recognizing them or their famous vessel, simply acknowledging fellow travelers on the sea. Mei waved back, thinking about the invisible barriers that separated people, the assumptions, the judgments, the artificial hierarchies. Perhaps they hadn't torn them all down, but they had made a small crack in one wall, and sometimes that was how the light got in. Back aboard the Azure Dragon, they stood on the deck watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Where to next?" Jiang Wei asked, looking at the navigation charts. Mei considered for a moment. "There's a small island in the northern chain. Very rustic, no luxury resorts at all. Just simple bungalows and local cuisine." "Sounds perfect," he agreed. As the yacht's engines hummed to life, May thought about the journey that had brought them here, not just the literal voyage on this magnificent vessel, but the path from that one-room apartment to their current life. They had changed, certainly, but in the ways that mattered most, their values, their connection to each other, their desire to make things better, they remained the same. And that, she reflected as they sailed away from Sapphire Bay, was the greatest luxury of all.